Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to make an outdoor shoulder bag. This is a great bag for hiking, cycling, or even just a day adventure. I loaded this bag up with a bunch of features, including a removable water bottle holder, a removable phone case, and elastic hooks. And this bag is on the easier side, so if you are new to sewing, you should have no problem following the detailed step-by-step tutorial. And with all that being said, if you're new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're gonna need 1 yard for your main fabric, and I recommend using a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all heavyweight, durable fabrics that are really easy to work with. And I'm gonna be utilizing a few of these fabrics, starting with a medium weight denim, a heavyweight canvas, and a lightweight nylon. I highly recommend using nylon ripstop fabric. It's a really nice, durable fabric, but like always, feel free to use whatever fabric that's really gonna pull out that design for you. You'll need a 1/4 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be a lighter weight lining. I'm gonna be doubling up and using the nylon. So use something that's lighter weight like a nylon or just a standard lining. You'll need a 1/4 yard of a padded material, something that's foam based and easy to sew through. I'm gonna be using an 1/8 inch foam paired with a meshed padded back. Both of these together will be my stabilizer for the middle and also padding for the back. So if you are using a foam based insert, you're not gonna want that exposed. So do something like I did and grab a meshed padded back. So that way it covers up that foam and acts as a real nice stabilizer. You'll need one 10-inch zipper or bigger. I'm gonna be cutting mine off a roll. I've been using this technique for the past few videos. It's a great way to save money and also get precise zippers with zero waste. You'll need 2 yards of 1.5 inch webbing. Going along with that 1.5 inch webbing, you'll need 4 strap sliders and 1 buckle. This is the hardware. You're gonna wanna get the same size as that 1.5 inch webbing. And if you choose to switch up the size of the webbing, definitely switch up the size of that hardware to match the size webbing you're using. And 1 yard of 3/4 to 1 inch webbing. And going along with that 3/4 to 1 inch webbing, you'll need 1 strap adjuster and 1 utility clip. You'll need about 10 inches of Velcro. I'm gonna be cutting mine off of a bigger piece. This way I can kind of play around with the size and reduce waste. And for the optional features, if you choose to add the elastic front, you're gonna need 1 yard of elastic cord. And I recommend grabbing anywhere from 1/8 to 3/16. I'm gonna be using 1/8. This is a perfect size, but feel free to use whatever size you want. Going along with that elastic cord, you're gonna need 1 cord stopper or hooks. The hooks are a fun alternative to the cord stopper because this really gives you the most utility out of that cord. But if you choose to use those hooks, just keep in mind you're gonna wanna get the hooks that match the size of your cord. And for the water bottle holder, you'll need a 1/4 yard of elastic band, and you can go anywhere from a 1/2 inch to 1 inch width. We're gonna be folding it over that raw edge, so you want enough elastic band to play around with. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super simple to use. All you have to do is print it out, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape it together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And after you have your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting.
And after taping it together, it should look like this. And for the best results, I recommend adjusting your printer alignment. From here, we're gonna cut on the outside of the black line. After cutting out your pattern, you should end up with 1 main pocket bottom side panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 main pocket top side panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 main pocket front lining panel cut out of your secondary fabric or main fabric, 1 main pocket front bottom panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 main pocket front top panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 water bottle pocket panel cut out of your main fabric on the fold, 4 phone pocket panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your secondary fabric. And I'm using the same fabric for my main fabric and secondary fabric. They're both lightweight, so feel free to use whatever you want. And lastly, 2 to 3 main base panels. 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 to 2 cut out of your padded fabric. And I'm gonna be using 2. I'm gonna be using a foam insert and a mesh padded back. The foam insert is gonna act as a stabilizer, and I'm gonna put that in between my main fabric and my mesh fabric. With your panels cut and organized, it's time to start construction. Grab your main base panels, and we're only gonna need the main fabric layer. Using the pattern, we're gonna mark out the webbing and Velcro placement guides. we are going to be placing 1.5 inch webbing under the Velcro, so that's why the guides are a little bit wider for the Velcro placement. So cut one 7.5 inch strip of webbing. Going along with that webbing, you'll need one slider. Slide the slider on your webbing, roll the webbing end over, and we're going to place this 7.5 inch strip on the top guide. Make sure the webbing end touches the inside edge, and the rolled side butts up against the outside marking. Pin the webbing into place and cut one 6-inch strip of webbing. Slide another slider on that 6-inch strip and place it in the marking right below the previous webbing. Make sure both of the inside edges are lined up and the rolled edges are at least an inch away from the outside edge. When you have them lined up and pinned down, we're going to go ahead and stitch the outside edges on both of the webbing strips. And I'm going to be using an edge presser foot for the sides. This helps me get a nice consistent stitch all the way down that straight edge. I will be switching back to a regular presser foot so I can butt right up against that slider. Feel free to add more tack stitches for extra strength. Next, we're going to grab the Velcro. Typically Velcro is sold in 1-inch widths, but I just grabbed a bigger piece so that way I can cut to the size I need with minimal waste. So there's a few different ways we can do this. We can totally cover that whole webbing strip with Velcro, or we can cut smaller pieces. I cut mine down to 3/4 of an inch. If you do cut them down, just make sure you place them in the center of that webbing. With both of the webbing strips in position, we're going to stitch around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. Even if you are using adhesive back, I still recommend adding a couple stitches. Next, we're going to grab our 1-inch or 3/4 inch webbing and cut it to go past the outside edges of our top. After cutting our smaller webbing, we're going to cut one more 4-inch strip out of our 1.5 inch webbing, slide our slider on the strip, fold it in half, place it in the top placement guide, and we're going to place the webbing over the raw ends. And this is optional, but we're going to add a utility clip on the opposite side. Since we are using the webbing to cover the raw ends, feel free to add more utility clips. As you can see, if you use a wider webbing, it's much easier to cover the webbing ends. Before we sew the webbing down, we're going to do a quick tack stitch around the outside edge of our 1.5 inch webbing, and do the same for the utility ring. This will give us just a little bit of extra strength. From here, we can add the cross webbing. Same goes for this webbing and slider, just make sure it's at least 1 inch away from the outside edge. Also, feel free to add more tack stitches to really lock this webbing into place. Moving on, grab your slider for your 1-inch or 3/4 inch webbing. Cut a 6.5 inch strip out of your smaller webbing. Slide the webbing through the back end of your strap adjuster. With the webbing hooked around the back bar, we're going to place it on the right hand side and loop it around our lower slider. To clean up the raw edge, we're going to roll one of the sides over and place it directly on top of the opposite end. From here, we're going to add a couple bar tack stitches. And with the smaller webbing, it can move up and down that slider and be able to work with multiple bottle sizes. For the opposite side, we're going to be cutting a 12-inch strip, but feel free to change the size. Maybe throw your bottle in there just to see how much it goes around. I definitely am cutting a little bit more, so I'm able to work with multiple bottle sizes, or I can just trim it down to size after I'm done. And once you determine the size, we're going to snip it at the back end of the webbing, and that's also the exact spot we're going to stitch it, directly lined up with our Velcro. And for the opposite end, we're going to feed it through our strap adjuster, roll the end over twice, and added bar tack. And that's going to help keep the end from sliding through the adjuster. With both ends stitched, it's always best to throw your water bottle in there just to test it out to make sure it is the right size before we move on. And from here, you can place that panel off to the side and grab your main pocket front top panel. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the elastic guides, and this is optional if you are going to be adding the elastic loops up front. If not, feel free to skip ahead. And I'm going to be cutting out 2 small strips of leather to place on those guides or any other small strip. We'll be adding 3 tack stitches to each side, and it's best to space them out evenly. An easy way to do this is fold it in half and mark at those folds on your guides, and then fold each half in half. Mark the guides on both sides, and this is going to be where you're adding the tack stitches. Since it is a smaller strip, I recommend dialing back the length on your machine for nice tight tack stitches. Repeat this process for the opposite side, and grab your main pocket front bottom panel. Line the straight edge up with the bottom of the top panel, place the right sides together, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right sides open, folding the seam allowance towards the bottom panel, and add a top stitch. After adding the top stitch, we're going to flip it to the back and snip the strips flush with the seam allowance. Grab your main pocket front lining panel. Lay it flat, and we're going to place our front assembly over top with wrong sides together. And before we do anything, we're going to stitch around the outside edge. I'm going to be using a serger to really lock these layers together, but feel free to use a zigzag stitch or a regular straight stitch. This is going to prevent future fraying, but it also covers up all that mess on the inside of the front panel to make for a more professional look. From here, we're going to grab our main pocket top side panel, find the zipper edge and also your zipper. We're going to be cutting the zipper just a little bit past the ends and place the zipper on that zipper edge with right sides together, lining it up in the center of that panel and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the right sides open to double check the stitch. And before we add our top stitch, we're actually going to be serging that inside raw edge. This is mainly to prevent fraying, but we're doing it also because we typically add bias tape, but this is a smaller pocket and bias tape is very bulky, so I wanted to show you a second method. And after adding the serge or zigzag stitch, we're going to flip the right sides open and add our top stitch. And I'm using that edge presser foot to get a perfectly straight stitch all the way across that panel. Next, grab your main pocket bottom side panel and grab your zipper assembly. If everything was done correctly, the width should be exactly the same. We're going to pin the sides together. The bottom panel is longer than the top, so we're going to have to kind of fold it to make sure it lines up with the ends and then stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just like the previous steps, before we add our top stitches, we're going to snip the zipper flush with the seam allowance and add a zigzag stitch to both of these raw edges. And I typically use bias tape, which will be coming up. I'm going to show you how to use that in future steps, but zigzag stitching also works and it's less bulky. Flip the right sides back out, fold the seam allowance towards the bottom panel and add your top stitch. Just be cautious going over the zippers. From here, mark the centers on both the top and bottom panel. Do the same for our front panel assembly. The side panel inside out, lining up the top and the bottom centers. And I highly recommend adding pins all the way around the outside. Once you have it lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around that outside edge. It can be tricky going around these corners, so just take your time and make sure you have those pins into place because those pins will really save you from having it offset. Snip the strips flush with the seam allowance. I always like to pop the right side out to double check to make sure all the layers got stitched onto that side panel and everything is still lined up in the center. If everything's looking pretty good, I'm going to flip the wrong side back out and we're going to add bias tape to this raw edge on the inside. And I'm going to show you a few different methods to achieve this. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags, but feel free to use whatever method that works best for you. And if you are curious, I'm using a 45mm bias tape binder for this bag. This bias tape is also going to help pop those corners out for a really nice professional look. Next, we're going to clean up those raw edges on the side panel, and to do this, we're going to add a serge. And like always, you can either serge it or zigzag stitch it. This is going to prevent fraying if you are using a fabric that's very loose. It's also going to have a cleaner look on the inside for future steps. Once you completed the serge or the zigzag stitch on that edge, we're going to roll that edge over just a 1/4 inch and add a top stitch all the way around that edge. And for this step, I am using the edge presser foot and I'm folding it as I go. You can pin all the way around, but since I added a serge, I'm actually using that as my measurement to get a perfect fold all the way around that outside edge. And you're going to want to try to make this as uniform as possible. Grab your main base panel, the one with the webbing strips, and we're going to use the pattern to find out where we're going to place this pocket. The biggest thing you want to make sure is that you have it even on both the side and the bottom edge, and also going over the webbing strips on the right side. We are using that pocket to hide those webbing strip ends. Pin the pocket into place, and we're going to stitch all the way around that pocket as close as you can to the outside edge. Or you can stitch on the opposite side of your top stitch. Either will work perfect for setting the pocket. After finishing up the stitch, it's best just to double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together and there's no openings in the pockets on the corners or the sides. Place it off to the side and grab all your other main base panels if you're using 1 or 2. We're going to be grabbing our mesh and our foam insert. I'm placing the mesh on the bottom, the foam insert in the middle. So the wrong side of the mesh is touching the right side of the foam insert. And I'm going to place the wrong side of the main fabric on top of the opposite side of the foam insert, essentially sandwiching the foam insert in between the mesh fabric and the main fabric. And from here, we're going to bias tape all the way around that outside edge. Again, I'm using a 45mm bias tape binder. This allows me to use more layers and it covers more of the edge. But feel free to use whatever size that looks best with the design you're going for. It is best to double check the edge because sometimes those bias tape binders can act out of whack. But if everything's looking good, we're going to place that panel off to the side and grab our phone pocket panels. This feature is optional, so feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to make this case. We'll be starting with just one of the main panels, and we're going to be cutting the Velcro to match the Velcro placement guide on our pattern. Make sure the height is the same, but feel free to adjust the width of the Velcro. From here, we're going to stitch around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. With our Velcro stitched on, we're going to grab the second main panel, cut a small Velcro strip out of the opposite side of our Velcro, place it lined up with the top portion of our placement guides. And this strip's going to have webbing connecting to it, so we're just going to double check to make sure that it matches the width of our webbing. Place the webbing strip on the top edge of our first main panel, and we're going to stitch on the outside edge of our Velcro, and also the top edge for our webbing as close as we can to that edge. Next, we're going to place the right sides together. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out our stitch points on both sides of the pattern, and we're going to do the same thing for the lining. From here, we're going to stitch from point to point at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Repeat the same thing for the lining, but once you get to the bottom of the lining, we're going to stop, skip to the opposite side, leaving an opening at the bottom, and continue stitching back up. After stitching, grab the lining and flip the right sides out. Before we slide it into the main fabric, we're just going to add a few notches on the corners. I'm using a thicker fabric. It's a good thing to do this if you are. It reduces bulk around the corner and just helps that corner pop. Place the lining on the inside of the main fabric with both the right sides together, lining up the top edge. With both sides lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the best way to do this is stitch one side, flip it over, kind of overlap on the back side of your previous stitch, and stitch to the opposite stitch where you started. Double check, make sure all the layers are sewn together, pull the lining out, find the opening you made in the lining, and we're going to pull everything through that opening. Just keep pushing until your entire bag is through and the right sides are out. When everything is out, we're going to seal off that opening by folding the right sides together and adding a stitch. After sealing off the lining opening, we're going to put the lining back to the inside of our main fabric. You're going to have to work the top edges to get them really nice and lined up, and once you do, we're going to add a top stitch on both of those sides. And it's best to match the thread color to your fabric color because this will hide any small imperfections. Fold the webbing end over, add a strip of Velcro covering up the raw edge of the webbing. Make sure the webbing lines up with the Velcro on the pocket. And if everything lines up, we're going to stitch around the outside edge of that Velcro. And that's going to complete our detachable phone pocket. And the biggest thing to know about this pocket is that you can actually change the size if you scale it up or down. And you're going to want to check this before you make the pocket because you're going to want to make it based off your phone size. Phones come in different sizes, so it's hard to get that perfect size. So just kind of double check it and scale it to the size of your phone. In this case, is designed to have a tight fit so that way it doesn't slide around or fall out when you're using the bag. And this is just a fun extra feature. Feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to make the phone pocket. Next, grab your water bottle pocket panel. And before we start sewing, we're going to grab a water bottle that we're going to use and actually sew it to that size. I made this panel a little bit bigger so that way you can take it in to match your water bottle size. And once you see the construction, you'll understand that it's fairly easy to measure it and take it to the exact size of your water bottle, or even just a standard size so you can use multiple water bottles. First, we're going to place the Velcro in the Velcro placement guides and stitch around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. With the Velcro stitched down, we're going to grab our 1/2 inch to 1 inch elastic. I do recommend using a wider Velcro because we're going to be rolling it around that raw edge. We're going to cut it smaller than the actual width of our panel. Another good test is wrap it around your water bottle, and if it's smaller than the actual circumference of your water bottle, it should be perfect size. Because you want that elastic to cinch around your water bottle. Cut 2 strips and we're going to fold it over the raw edge and kind of stretch it as we sew. And it's really that simple, you just pull the elastic as you're stitching so that way it lines up perfectly with the width of your panel. If you don't get it perfect the first time, you can always de-thread and try it again. From here, we're going to flip the right sides together, line up both of the sides, and we're going to add a stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, we're going to flip the right sides back out, fold the seam allowance to the left or the right, and add a top stitch. We folded our seam allowance to the right, and we're going to add a top stitch on the right side. And since you don't have a lot of space to work with, you kind of have to move it as you stitch. Next, we're going to be adding elastic on the bottom, and it's going to be going across so that way the water bottle can stay in there and not fall through. And it's more just for a fail-safe, but the thing is you're going to want to cut the strip long enough so that way the water bottle has some room and you can push it through. After cutting the strip, we're going to stitch it to the inside edge of our elastic. And you're going to want to make sure it goes straight across the bottom. After adding the elastic, we're going to slide our water bottle in just to give it a test run to see if it fits. I definitely could have made mine smaller for more of an elastic cinch and also a bigger bottom so the water bottle could go through a little bit more, but that's what I'm talking about, just test it. Play around with the sizes to get that perfect fit for your water bottle. Moving on to the last step, we're going to make the strap, so start by cutting an 8-inch strip out of your 1.5 inch webbing, grab your 1.5 inch buckle, feed the webbing through one of the sides of your buckle. With the end through the buckle, we're going to roll the end over once and add a nice bar tack stitch. I recommend using a heavier weight needle for this thicker webbing. Slide the opposite end of the webbing through our top slider, roll the end over once just like the opposite side, and add a nice bar tack stitch. And having these sliders helps us move the strap around for a better fit. Next, we're going to cut a 42-inch strip of webbing. Start by feeding it through the top slider, rolling the end over once, and adding a bar tack stitch. Next, we're going to feed the double opening strap slider on the opposite end of the webbing. Slide it down about halfway, feed that same webbing end through the opposite side of your buckle, and we're going to pull that webbing end back through the double opening slider from the back opening to the front opening. This will be done from the bottom side of the slider, and lastly stitch that webbing end back to itself. This will create a nice looking, easy to adjust loop. And finally, getting to the last step, we're going to add the elastic hooks. Grab the elastic cord of your choice. I'm using 1/8 of an inch. I cut mine to 1 yard, and you can always trim this down after you feed it through your loops. You can feed it however you want, but I like to start at the top and work my way down towards the bottom openings. And once you have the elastic fed all the way to the bottom, you can either use a cord stopper, and this is simply where you just feed both of the ends through the cord stopper and you can use it as a cinch. The second option is using elastic hooks, and be sure to grab the correct size for your cord. These are just as easy to install, you just feed them on and snap the hook into place. I do like the hooks that give you just a little bit more use out of that elastic. The last step is to add your branding. I always like to add mine in areas that I can clip things to.
And there you have it, your outdoor shoulder bag is complete. Hopefully you enjoyed this pattern. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. And I really hope you enjoyed this design. I thought this was a super fun design. I like adding extra features in and really packing it full so you can get the most use out of your bag. Like always, comment down below what you want to see me make. Also comment down below if you have any questions or even some features you would like to see in the bag. And before I go, if yours did not turn out the greatest, it definitely takes some practice. It takes doing it multiple times and also setting yourself up with the correct tools. If you plan on making a lot of bags, garments, or pretty much anything, you're gonna wanna set yourself up with the right sewing machines and the right attachments. This will make your life so much easier. And in the future, I'll make an essential video of all the stuff I really think you need for getting started. But anyways, hope everyone stays safe. I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.